I'm your host. My name is Ryan Dusick. You may not know that name, Ryan Dusick, and I don't blame you if you don't. But I have a feeling you know the name Maroon 5, which was the band that I started with my three best friends, Adam and Jesse and Mickey, in my parents' garage when I was 16 years old. It might start to make sense why my podcast is called Harder to Breathe now, if you know that fact. I've been out of the band since 2006, so it's been a while, almost feels like a lifetime since I was a member of that band. And my life has changed pretty dramatically in the time since I left the band. So here I am today. I'm a therapist. I'm an author. I've been doing speaking and advocacy work for mental health. And my life looks pretty different than it did when I was in the band. And I realized that I have some stories to tell, some lessons I've learned, both in my own experience and in my education as a mental health clinician, that it would be a shame not to share some of that with people that might, really gain something from hearing these stories and hearing these lessons. So let me give you a little bit more of my background so you understand how this podcast, the Harder to Breathe podcast, came to be and why I named it that. So I started the band when I was 16 years old in my parents' garage with Adam, Jesse, and Mickey. And at that point in my life, it was everything to me. It was my spiritual connection as well as my creative outlet and expression. The friendship that we had between the four of us was really my entire social world at that point. And we spent a decade from the garage building the band all the way up to the Maroon 5 that you know now, being an international success story. We started the band in 1994. It was 2004 when we had that kind of success. It was a whole decade. A lot of stories along the way, as you can imagine, which I'll get into in some of the episodes of this show. But really, the takeaway from that time in my life was that it was an extremely uplifting, inspiring time of inspiration, of being connected to purpose and meaning, and having a relationship that was not just a business relationship, but a friendship and a meaningful, deep connection that created a lot of fulfillment in my life. However, I had some issues that I hadn't dealt with. I didn't even realize there were issues. It was latent anxiety and depression, perfectionism, a lot of pressure I put on myself that became a problem for me when the band became very successful in the early 2000s. And at that point, when we're in the middle of this worldwide campaign on the album Songs About Jane to become one of the biggest bands in the world, it was a little late in the game for me to come to grips with the fact that I didn't have the best coping skills for dealing with the kind of pressure that we were under. So it was really an intersection of the internal pressure that I'd always put on myself with now the external pressure and demands of this life that we had created in building our career up to that point. And long story short, I'll get into it in more detail later, but long story short, I had a breakdown that manifested physically. My ability to play the drums was suffering. In retrospect, I'm able to recognize that the breakdown was largely emotional and psychological and spiritual, as well as physical, because, they're all connected. You can't really separate the body from the mind. They're one and the same as I understand it now. So I started having physical pain, but really what I was having was deep down existential pain. So bad that eventually I just completely lost the ability to play the drums. And I had to walk away from the band just as we were having all the success that we had dreamt of having for all those years. A decade into our career, all the way from my garage to the biggest arenas in the world. I mean, at this point in our career, we were winning Grammy Awards. We were playing on Saturday Night Live and The Tonight Show. We were rubbing elbows with, some of our heroes, Stevie Wonder, Prince. We were meeting celebrities and living the good life, the glamorous life of fame and fortune that you can only imagine. And inside, I was really struggling and breaking down. And the band had to move on without me, just as we were getting ready to make the follow-up to Songs About Jane. And that was the most devastating thing that I've ever dealt with in my life. And I spent about a decade really struggling with the grief of that loss, not just the loss of that career, the thing that we had built through hard work and determination, but the loss of my identity that was very wrapped up in that career. It was at the core of my self-definition. It was everything. My entire ego, my entire self-esteem was built around being a member of that band, being a founding member, being the drummer. And those relationships, it was my social world. It was everything. So I was really struggling, and I was self-medicating, doing all the things you do when you're struggling with existential pain and just trying to find any way to cope with it, to avoid the feelings, to escape the feelings. And it took me another decade really to find closure on that time in my life. Now, thankfully, I was able to find recovery from alcoholism, from pretty severe anxiety disorder and depression, and really the trauma of everything that I'd gone through. And the process of that recovery revealed new purpose for me. I got kind of addicted to service, which is a much healthier addiction than alcohol and some of the other things that I was doing. Being of service got me out of self. It got me out of the self-obsession that was a big part of my suffering. And I got really inspired by mental health and psychology. I started volunteering at a recovery center. I was working the 12 steps, and I was just in a place where I was open to the possibility that life had more to offer me than what I'd been doing in those 10 years and just trying to forget the past or get through the rest of my life after the big letdown that had been that first career. And in the process of opening myself up to new possibilities and opportunities, I had this idea, well, maybe I want to do this for a living. Maybe I want to, rather than just be a volunteer, become a drug counselor, an addiction specialist, or a therapist of some kind. And I went back to school. I mean, I didn't even know if I'd be able to go back to school. I had an undergrad degree from UCLA in English. And here I was wanting to apply for a master's degree in psychology. So I didn't know if that was going to work. Turns out it worked out pretty well, and I got into the graduate program at Pepperdine University for the master's degree in clinical psychology. And a month later, I'm in classes studying to become a therapist. So this was just a complete left turn from what I had imagined and what my life was when I was in my addiction and when I was really struggling. And my life has changed really dramatically in the last 8 years since I got sober and started this journey. And so here I am now, 8 years into recovery. I'm a therapist. I've been seeing clients for a few years now. In the course of my studies, I decided to write a book about my journey because I realized I had all these stories to tell that some of them were just entertaining, but a lot of them were uplifting for me. So I figured they might be inspirational to others if they needed a little bit of hope in their lives, struggling with some of the things that I had struggled with. And it just came to me that sharing my story was another way to be of service, another thing that could be fulfilling and offer me more purpose and meaning in my life. So I started writing this book, Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. So it makes sense now, maybe why I'm naming the podcast Harder to Breathe as well. It's connected to that book. Well, essentially, let me explain that a little bit more, actually. The Harder to Breathe, of course, you probably know the song Harder to Breathe if you are a Maroon 5 fan. But the name of that song and the reason for choosing it for the book and for the podcast has a couple different layers to it for me. I actually named the book Harder to Breathe before I even started writing it, just because it felt so spot on for what it was I was trying to address and talk about in the book. Essentially, the first way in which I relate to it is some of the symptoms of anxiety that I had in my teenage years in high school, when I didn't even know that's what it was. I didn't have the word anxiety to describe it. It was just a feeling in my chest. It was a tightness. It was a lump in my throat. It was a feeling of being disconnected from my surroundings, walking around campus in high school and just feeling like I wasn't really there because I was very much consumed with my own being. I would even get fixated on my breathing to the point where I felt like I was almost hyperventilating, and I would get lightheaded. And so the phrase harder to breathe, I relate to that moment when I first discovered that maybe anxiety was something that was an issue for me, even though I didn't have the vocabulary at that point to describe what that was. Now, fast forward, whatever it was, 6-8 years into the life of the band had been my coping mechanism. It had been the thing that helped me escape that feeling. When I was playing with the band, it was freedom, it was fun, it was expression, it was everything that I wanted life to be, and I was getting away from the stuff that had been difficult or more painful when I was playing with my brothers in the band. But now we were signed to our second record deal and writing music for the album that became Songs About Jane. And this is something that happens with bands and artists when they're getting ready to make a record. It's kind of almost a cliche. The record label comes in and just keeps telling you, you need to write a hit. You need to write a hit. Oh, you think you have a hit? You need to write more hits. And that was what was going on with our record label at the time. And so we were feeling the pressure of that. I know Adam was in particular. Adam Levine, of course, the very famous rock star, pop star that he is now, that everyone knows and loves. At the time, we were nobodies, and we were trying to make a name for ourselves. So there was a lot of pressure landing on his shoulders, being the main songwriter and lyricist. We had the task of putting together like 3 or 4 more songs on one last-ditch demo before we went into the studio to record. And our attitude was like, let's just finish up these scraps of songs we started, give them to the record label to appease them so we can get into the studio. And Adam was kind of pissed off, and we were all a little bit angry, a little bit frustrated, and feeling that pressure of the label breathing down our necks to churn out hits on demand. So Adam is sitting in the corner while the rest of us are jamming on this riff, and he steps up to the mic and starts singing what became the song Harder to Breathe. And we all knew what he was singing about. He was singing about the pressure that we were all feeling, but him in particular. But I really related to that because that was my experience internally. The way that I, dealt with life up until that point was always to internalize pressure, to put stress on myself to be the best I could be. I don't think the outside world necessarily always saw that in me. I think my demeanor might have been a relaxed guy a lot of the time. I wasn't necessarily someone who struck people as an uptight or stressed out guy, but I think underneath that surface or that mask that I wore a lot of the time, there was a lot of pressure and stress inside. And so I really connected with that song at the time that he wrote it. And then fast forward a couple years when we're on the road promoting the album, Harder to Breathe was the first single. It came out in the summer of 2002, around the time that the album came out. And we were tasked with basically promoting that song at every radio station, on every TV show, in every in-store appearance for a fan club, every video, photo shoot, everything we were doing was centered around that song for like a year of our lives. Going from playing clubs all the way up to playing arenas, opening up for bigger artists like John Mayer and Counting Crows and Matchbox 20 at that point. And so in the course of that journey, we played that song over and over and over again, and my body was breaking down. I was feeling the strain and the stress of all the touring and the pressure of performing day after day in all these venues. And so the meaning of that song, the lyric that Adam had written, took on new meaning for me. Looking back on it now, I was feeling harder to breathe in that I put all this pressure on myself, but now there was this external pressure as well. And so it was really kind of a powder keg. It was something that was bound to break at a certain point because I didn't have really good coping skills at that point. So when you put those things together, the phrase harder to breathe has a lot of different layers to it for me. And it just made a lot of sense because it does connote the experience, the physical experience of anxiety. And I just thought that made a lot of sense for my book. And now taking this to another level and another medium, to extend the phrase into this medium makes sense as well. So what does that mean for this show? What is this show going to be? How does it pertain to? I'm not going to tell my story every week. Obviously, I'm going to tell stories here and there, and hopefully there'll be some lessons learned from my experience, but more importantly, from the platform that I have now as an advocate, somebody who has an education and experience working with people in a clinical capacity. I'll be able to share things that are helpful to people that want to hear some solutions to the things that I'm talking about. But I also want to have conversations, and this is going to be a big part of the show. The centerpiece of this, other than me just talking to you every week, is to have conversations with people who are in the kind of positions that I was in when I had my breakdown, and people that have either had breakdowns themselves or have been able to find ways to work through it and have continued to have success in the positions where performance is at the highest level. I'm talking about top performers, entertainers, musicians, artists, but also athletes and entrepreneurs, titans of industry, CEOs of big companies, and anyone who feels the kind of stresses that we all feel, however, have been able to reach levels of success where they can talk about what is required to not just work through and survive some of the stresses, but to actually thrive and succeed, continue to succeed. Now, sometimes having that success, which I've learned, of course, doesn't mean that you're necessarily thriving personally, even though you're having success externally. You might be having financial success. You might be running a great company. You might be an artist that's well known or an athlete who's succeeding, but your personal life might be falling apart. You might have, symptoms that the public doesn't see or that your company doesn't see. And so a big part of this show for me is going to be about the willingness to be vulnerable. I think we need more models of vulnerability, in particular, male models of vulnerability, because historically, men, and I include myself in this, even though I think of myself as a relatively sensitive guy, culturally, we've been held to this standard that we have to be strong, that we have to be tough. And I contest that being strong does not mean avoiding vulnerability, that being able to embrace vulnerability is actually a sign of strength, because real courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to feel the fear and be able to work through it and do it anyway, because you're able to overcome that fear or that discomfort. To me, experiencing vulnerability is not a weakness. It's actually a strength. And it's also, to me, the first step in any healing. Looking inward with self-compassion, looking inward with curiosity, and understanding why we may have certain vulnerabilities. I know that for me, I escaped and I've avoided that process for a really long time. I did it through self-medication. I did it through just avoiding any kind of new responsibilities or anything that would make me uncomfortable. And in the process of doing things just continued to get worse and worse. My anxiety actually progressed and got worse over time. It wasn't until I stopped running away from it, stopped trying to escape and avoid the discomfort, that I was able to start to process those feelings and actually learn why I was challenged in those ways, what was so painful about it, and what it was going to be required of me to heal and to grow. And once I did that, the challenges that I used to see as threats, the opportunities or the things that looked really scary to me, now just looked like opportunities and possibilities to learn more, to grow more, to pursue new things in life that might provide new purpose, new meaning. So for me, that's paramount to what I want to talk about, just individually, but also in these conversations that I have with these impressive people. What does vulnerability mean to them? And are they willing to go to that place where they talk about some of the things that maybe they don't always show the public, they don't always incorporate into their public image or to their platform as a professional? Those are the kind of conversations I want to have. Because in my work as a therapist, the thing that I've recognized most, and in particular with men, because I think that as boys and men, we often relate to one another through sports or through having fun and partying or talking about girls, all the ways in which we escape real emotions or real vulnerabilities by externalizing things. I've realized in my work that we all basically have the same needs. We have the same basic emotions. And if we deny them, we end up with bigger problems than we would have if we just dealt with them and allowed them to the surface. So I want to talk to some really incredible, really strong people, some of which may have dealt with this and been willing to be vulnerable and have found ways to incorporate that into their lifestyle in a way that has been really healthy for them and allowed them to thrive and reach new levels of fulfillment while continuing to succeed. But some of them, maybe they haven't. Maybe some of them need to have these conversations and learn and grow as well. So that's kind of my aim for the conversations that I want to have. But this is it's not that this only applies to people in really high positions of high performance or high status. However, I think that anyone can relate to these topics. I mean, for me, it was perfectionism and holding myself up to high standards. And then it was anxiety and depression, trauma, and substance use. Those are all issues that I think most people grapple with in one way or another in their lives. So you don't have to be the CEO of a major corporation. You don't have to be, the drummer in Maroon 5 or the singer in whatever band or an athlete and playing professionally to have experienced some of the pressures that we'll be talking about on this show. You just have to be a human being who's tried to get through life without suffering too much and finding ways to actually find contentment and fulfillment and, dare I say, happiness. So I think that there's going to be a little bit of everything for you and for anyone who is interested in just learning and growing with me. That's another thing. I don't consider myself a finished product, even though I've been through a lot and I, am a professional and I talk about this stuff when I speak as an advocate. I'm a work in progress. And one of my mottos is progress, not perfection. That's something I learned from the 12-step community. If I'm fixated on comparing myself to some standard of perfection, I'm always going to be falling short. That's just the nature of it because perfection is an illusion. It doesn't exist. If I'm looking, though, at the progress that I've made and the progress that I can make right now, today in the present, just one step, just what's the next indicated action that I can take to learn or to grow or to heal in some way today, then I'm always succeeding, right? I mean, that's the difference. You're either always failing or you're always succeeding based upon your mindset. If it's progress, you're succeeding. If it's perfection, you're always failing. So to me, that's a no-brainer. And I try to be vulnerable, and when I speak, I try to share that I still struggle with some of these things. I may be in a place where I would tell you I'm thriving as a person and as a professional, but I'm also somebody who has a lot of trauma in my past from my past experience, and I carry that with me. My relationship to music is a complicated one for that reason. My relationship with performance is a complicated one. I put this book out in the world, Harder to Breathe, a year and a half ago, and I keep getting asked to do, interviews on people's shows and to go speak at conferences and events as a keynote speaker. And every time I step on a stage, I get that rush again of all that pressure I would put on myself, the nerves of having been on stage and experiencing failure, not being able to perform to the level that I wanted to. So that's something I have to work through, and it manifests itself in very tangible ways for me. But I'm working through it now. Now, when I approach these things, I look at them as challenges, not as threats. That's another motto that I find to be really helpful. When you are walking into something that is scary, that's overwhelming, that may create a feeling of anxiety, you could very easily see that as a threat. That's what anxiety is, right? It seems like this is almost life-threatening. I need to run away. You go into that fight or flight mode. When the reality is it's not life or death, right? There's no tiger or lion chasing you in that moment. Probably. I hope not. What's most likely happening is that you've just had this conditioned response that this thing, because of past failures or because of some core belief that you have about yourself, that you're not going to be good enough, or some inner critic is telling you that there's going to be failure or disappointment or embarrassment. You've now turned it into a life and death situation. And so now you see it as a threat rather than just as a challenge to overcome. When in the reality, it is just that. It's just a challenge. Even if it's something that we're not totally prepared for, I walk into situations that I've never done before. I mean, it was scary for me to go back to school and grad school 20 years after my undergrad and walk into a psychology program that I had no experience with, especially with where my anxiety had been in the worst years of it, when I was drinking myself to sleep on my couch every night because I was having panic attacks and because I was agoraphobic. The idea of going into a classroom and eventually getting up in front of the class and giving a lecture on mindfulness, that was an impossibility. That was not something I could have fathomed without having a panic attack or being heavily medicated to do so. But I did it. And I was shaking like a leaf the first time I did it, but the next time I did it, it wasn't quite as bad. And here I am now speaking on stages in front of hundreds of people, going on people's shows, podcasts, radio, TV, and speaking. And it's not that I don't feel the anxiety. It's not that I don't see it as a challenge. It's just that it's a challenge now that I'm willing to walk into and allow myself the grace, allow myself the self-compassion to not be perfect, to be a work in progress that's just showing up and trying to work through that process. And so doing that has allowed me to grow and to get better at these things. And that's the change for me. It's like redefining that anxiety, changing my relationship to it, to recognize that anxiety isn't always bad. Sometimes it's excitement. That was another thing I had trouble with in my years of heavy anxiety. Was I had forgotten that excitement was a different thing than anxiety, because it's the same rush of physical feelings, right? The symptoms are the same. You get the butterflies, you get the heartbeat racing, you might sweat, you might get shaky. All of those feelings, the butterflies, the shakiness, the nerves, you get those in anticipation of the things you're really, really looking forward to, as well as the things that are frightening. You know, the first time you go on a roller coaster, you're looking forward to it. It's going to be fun, but you get the butterflies and the nerves. The first time you go on a date, the first time you get to kiss somebody that you're in love with, you're going to get all those feelings, those butterflies, those feelings of, you might be sweating, you might be shaking, but it's a good sweating and shaking, because it's in anticipation of something that you really want to do. I would even contest that the most important moments of our lives are usually preceded by those symptoms. And yet, for those of us who have struggled with anxiety, we see that as something to avoid. And then we end up avoiding things that might be really enriching of our lives, things that might be wonderful, and beyond allowing us to grow and overcome it, might actually lead to some happiness and fulfillment. So it's the attitude of seeing challenges, not threats, being open to the possibility that it might be an opportunity, not something that's going to be terrifying. Another thing about anxiety, and I don't want to belabor this too much in our first episode, because there's going to be many to come, and I'll talk about these things in conversation. But anxiety is, I like to look at anxiety as nature's performance enhancer. If you are going to, I'll use baseball as a metaphor because that was my first love before music. Sports metaphors might not work for everyone, but this is a good one for me. If you're going to try to hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball, no matter how talented you are, no matter how much, if you've played baseball your whole life, and at the top of the game, if you're gearing up to hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball, you better have a little bit of those nerves going, because that's firing adrenaline and cortisol and all those hormones and neurotransmitters that allow your brain and body to function at the highest level in that moment, to react very quickly, to think on your feet. Now, you don't need that in your daily life. You're not trying to hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball every single day of your life, unless you're a professional baseball player, in which case you have to adapt to that. But for most of us, we have moments where we have to step up to another level. It might be in class as a student, having to get up in front of the class and give a talk. It might mean situations where you have to step up and be, really in the middle of a crisis, have to be there for other people and be somebody has strength and resilience and work through something. There's a lot of reasons why at certain moments in your life, you might have to step up a little bit and perform in some way, even if you're not a performer per se, or somebody who has a lot of responsibility usually. And in those moments, that's what that performance enhancer is there for, is to take us to that next level. So it's not a bad thing. It serves a function in our lives. When you change your relationship to it and you realize anxiety is not something to be avoided at all costs, it's something we want to alleviate the experience of on a daily basis so we're not taxed by it, which is what I was experiencing when I was on the road. I was traveling around, and every single day I was having adrenaline pumping through my body, and that level of cortisol can cause inflammation. It can cause your immune system to break down and literally, cause joint problems and nerve problems for me, and eventually some psychological issues that led to the inability to play. If you have the coping skills, which I didn't have at that time, but I've learned since, if you have the ability to self-soothe through meditation, through self-care, through being able to express the feelings and get them off your chest and share them with other human beings and get support, to work through them in therapy. There's so many different things that we'll talk about on the show that are tools for working through the anxiety. When you do that, you're not carrying that baseline of anxiety with you on a daily basis, and therefore you're not being taxed to that level. That doesn't mean you never experience anxiety. You need anxiety at some points. You need that fight or flight when you do need to run away from that lion, when you do need to run really fast, when you do need to think on your feet. And when I'm, invited to go on somebody else's show and have a conversation, and I don't know what the questions are going to be ahead of time, I like to be at my best. I like to be ready to address the situation with my wits about me. And if I'm not a little bit keyed up in that situation, if my heart isn't racing a little bit, I'm not going to be at my best, right? I'm not going to have a great conversation and be able to think on my feet and say something that's going to be positive and helpful to someone. So I've changed my relationship with the anxiety. I try to reduce it on a daily basis, but I try to harness it when I need it to perform to a certain level. I have a feeling that some of the people I'm going to talk to on the show have a similar relationship with anxiety. I think top athletes would tell you that if you don't have the butterflies, then you're probably done. You need those butterflies to perform at the highest level. I think there are probably a lot of people in these positions of high responsibility and high stress that have learned how to harness that experience of anxiety for when they need it and not when they don't. So I want to get into that. We're going to get into a lot of really interesting stuff. We're going to tell some stories. I'm looking forward to the whole process a lot. This is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to talk about music. Obviously music is my past, and the people that maybe hear about the show might be fans of the band or music in general. So I don't want to diminish that part of my life just because I'm a mental health clinician now. We're going to talk about a lot of different forms of art, though, and we're going to talk about the different ways in which people relate to these things in ways that might be different than the way that I do. Because my experience is my experience. I've been through a lot of things in my life, and I do share those things with my clients. But I'm just one guy. I don't presume that everyone's experience is the same as mine. So that leads me to the last topic I want to talk about a little bit today, which is curiosity. Curiosity for self, curiosity for others, curiosity for the experience of living. I think the first step, I talked about it a little bit earlier, vulnerability and self-compassion being the pathways to healing. You have to be able to look inward and give yourself that grace to start the process of healing. Curiosity is the attitude with which you do that. I think so much of the time we look at the parts of ourselves that are struggling, the parts that are not performing to the level that we want, or that can even be self-defeating. And we look at them with judgment and criticism. And we say things to ourselves like, I should be doing this, or I should be doing better. And so much of the conversation that I hear on the topic of self-help and self-improvement is kind of this mindset approach of determination and discipline and enacting things to change your life. And here's what you got to do today so that you can be where you want to be tomorrow, and defining success in whatever terms, reply to the future, and whether it's financial success, career success, relationship success. I'd like to make the argument on this show that we're skipping a step when we do that. The most important first step is to look inward with curiosity, because that attitude of curiosity allows you to have that self-compassion for self. By approaching the parts of you that are critical, judgmental, defensive, protective, by approaching those parts with curiosity rather than judgment, you're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to show self-compassion to those parts that need it. And that is what is going to begin the healing process, the growing process. And ultimately, that's going to lead to more sustainable growth. That's going to change your relationship to yourself and lead to self-acceptance, lead to fostering self-esteem. And those things will allow you then to walk into the world with more confidence, with more determination and discipline, and not something that you're imposing on yourself like your own drill sergeant, but something that you're doing as an act of self-love, a gift that you're giving yourself to take on new challenges, to discover new horizons and find new meaning and purpose and ultimate fulfillment in your life. That's what I'm trying to do on a daily basis. And again, I'm not a finished product. I'm a work in progress, but I've gotten to where I have in my journey because I've been willing to look inward with curiosity and self-compassion and start that healing process. And now I'm in a place where when I see something that might be challenging, I can see it as an opportunity, not as a threat. That it's just a challenge, it's something to grow through. So curiosity, how do we take that out into the world? If you show up to the things that you're doing with curiosity, that's a great combatant for the fear or the anxiety. Curiosity is openness. It's allowing things in. It's an ability to integrate new things into your mind and heart in a way that maybe you're not capable of when you're fearful or when you're avoiding or trying to push away something uncomfortable. So I hope that I can show curiosity for my guests. I hope that I can show curiosity for anything that arises in the course of the show that's challenging and new and different. I actually look forward to those things now in a way that is so incredible to me, because I pushed them away for a long time in my life. So I wish that for you, if you're listening to the show, I wish that for you to adopt this mindset of curiosity, to have compassion for yourself, and to be open to the possibility that, maybe life has some challenges in it. We know it does. We know life is going to be, it's up and down, and sometimes things get difficult. That's reality. But if you're open to the possibility that those things might lead to growth, then every negative experience could be leading to the next really positive one. I didn't know that leaving the band Maroon 5 a decade later would lead to some of the most uplifting and fulfilling moments and things in my life that have given me new purpose and meaning. I thought at that time that it was just this horrible, devastating thing that was the end of what I thought my life was going to be, the identity that I had constructed. Turns out I could create a new identity through the things in my life that were creating new purpose and continue to create new horizons for me. So anyway, I've talked enough for today. Those are some of the topics that I'd like to address on this show, and I'll continue to speak, I'll continue to write, and I want to make this show sort of the centerpiece of the things that I continue to learn about with curiosity. So thank you for listening. Tune in again to the next episode. I'm going to try to do one once a week. It might end up being more than that. We'll see how many guests I can get on and how much I have to talk about. I'm very excited. I'm very enthusiastic. I hope that you are too, because it's going to be an interesting ride. We're going to have some amazing conversations. I look forward to it. So, Harder to Breathe, my new podcast. Tune in every week, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.